Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to take a deep dive into something we use every single day, but maybe don't think too much about?
Always up for a challenge. What you got in mind?
Quotation. You know those little curly things we put around words?
Oh yeah, quotation marks. Seems simple enough, right?
Yeah, deceptively so. We're going to uncover a whole world of philosophical puzzles hiding right there under our noses.
I'm intrigued.
Because it turns out philosophers and linguists have been wrestling with quotations for over a century.
Really? Over 100 years just thinking about quotation marks.
It all goes back to Frege, the granddaddy of modern logic and philosophy of language. And even after all this time, there's still no clear consensus on some pretty fundamental questions.
Wow, that's surprising. Maybe it's because quotation, for all its ubiquity, hasn't always gotten the same kind of intense attention as other big philosophical topics.
Yeah, like the nature of truth or reference. It's almost like we take it for granted because we use it all the time.
Right, it's so familiar that we might underestimate just how tricky it gets when you start digging into the philosophical details.
That's right. In fact, one of the sources even mentions Davidson's early experience with quotation. He was told it was a shady device and basically warned against confusing use and mention. But those who stop there miss out on a huge area of inquiry. To really appreciate the puzzle, let's start with some classic examples that pop up all over the place in the literature.
Okay, hit me with them.
Number one, snow is white is true in English if and only if snow is white.
Classic.
Number two, Aristotle refers to Aristotle.
Okay, seeing the pattern.
Number three, they is the definite article in English. And finally, number four, bachelor has 8 letters. What do you notice about these examples?
Well, in each of them, we're using language to talk about language. It's like language is bending back on itself, becoming self-referential.
Exactly. And that's where things get philosophically interesting. Why should a philosopher, someone deeply concerned with meaning and truth and reference, be so fascinated by something as seemingly mundane as quotation?
Well, there are several reasons, and they all go right to the heart of philosophical inquiry into language. First off, as you pointed out, quotation is our primary tool for what we call meta-linguistic discourse. It's how we talk about language using language. It's like using a microscope to examine the very lens of the microscope itself.
Right, it's a tool for self-reflection built into the very structure of language. If we want to develop theories about how language works, we can't ignore this essential tool.
Right, and it's not just about how quotations function, it's also about what they refer to. When we say, for instance, that Aristotle refers to Aristotle, what exactly is that first bit, the Aristotle in quotes, picking out? Is it the same kind of thing in every instance of quotation? Those are real head scratchers.
I see. It's not just about the mechanics, but about the objects of reference involved in quotation. So we're already knee-deep in philosophy of language here.
Absolutely. And don't forget about opacity. That's a central idea in the field. And quotation provides a perfect illustration. Remember, opacity is when you can't swap out terms with the same reference or meaning without potentially changing the truth of a sentence.
Right. It breaks that basic principle of substitutivity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's easy to see this with quotation. For example, bachelor has 8 letters. True statement. But if we substitute unmarried man, which means the same thing, we get unmarried man has 8 letters, suddenly it's false.
It's like those quotation marks create a special zone where the usual rules of meaning and reference are suspended.
Exactly. That's a big clue about the unique nature of quotation and linguistic representation itself.
And the source material also points out this strange thing about quotation, that it's a referential device where, in a way, the quote uses its own referent to do the referring. It's a bit mind-bending.
It really is. Think about it. Aristotle is referring to the word Aristotle. It's like a snake eating its own tail. The letters themselves are part of both the quotation and the thing being quoted.
Right. It's almost like the word is displaying its own form just by being quoted. Totally different than how Aristotle picks out a person.
Exactly. And all this gets even more interesting when you consider theories of quotation and their implications for the semantics-pragmatics distinction. How much of the meaning of a quoted utterance is inherent in the words themselves, and how much is determined by context and the speaker's intentions?
Okay, that is a really big question in philosophy of language. Is meaning fixed, or is it fluid and dependent on context?
Right. And quotation, especially when you get to things like mixed quotation, really pushes the boundaries of that distinction. And then from a more technical angle, trying to formalize quotation in a system of semantics gets really tricky.
You mean like using logic and symbols to represent meaning?
Exactly. It forces you to confront things like indexicality, the idea that meaning can shift with context, something called monstrosity, which are these weird cases that seem to break the rules of semantics, and compositionality.
Compositionality, that's a big one.
Yeah, the idea that the meaning of a complex expression is built up from the meanings of its parts. But quotation often seems to resist that kind of straightforward analysis. It's like a wrench in the gears of traditional semantic theories.
So those little quotation marks, they look so innocent, but they actually force us to confront some of the most foundational issues in philosophy of language.
Exactly. That's why it's such a rich area for philosophical exploration. And that brings us to what we're trying to do here in this deep dive. We're going to try to unpack some of these core questions and look at the different and often conflicting ways philosophers have tried to answer them.
Okay, so we're setting out on a philosophical quest into the land of quotation marks. But as I understand it, this isn't a field where everyone agrees on the answers or even what the right questions are.
You got that right. There's a remarkable lack of consensus, not just on what the best theory is, but even on what the core data is that a theory needs to explain. It's like we don't even agree on what we're arguing about.
It's interesting and kind of frustrating, I imagine, for philosophers who like things to be clear and well-defined. So where do we even begin? The source material starts by talking about how we characterize quotation itself.
Right. It might seem obvious, but it's a surprisingly slippery concept. How do we actually pin down what counts as quotation in the first place? We can start with intuitive examples, of course, like when we have a sentence like, bachelor has 8 letters.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, the subject of that sentence, bachelor, is a quotation. Or take a sentence like, Quine said, quotation has a certain anomalous feature.
Okay, yeah, the part in single quotes there is a direct quote.
Right. These are examples of what we'd call direct or pure quotation. But when you try to move from those intuitive examples to a precise definition, things get tricky.
I see. Well, the obvious thing to point to is the quotation marks themselves. But the source material says that a definition based solely on syntax, the presence of those little marks runs into problems. Why is that?
Well, think about spoken language. Do we have a spoken equivalent of quotation marks? Not really.
We don't go around saying quote and unquote all the time.
Exactly. So right off the bat, a purely syntactic definition would exclude a huge swath of what we intuitively consider quotation.
Okay, that's a problem.
And even in written English, we don't always use quotation marks to indicate quotation.
Mm.
Sometimes we use italics, like in academic writing.
Right, right.
So if our definition is tied to specific typographic marks, we end up excluding other perfectly valid ways of signaling that we're talking about an expression as an expression.
So we can't just rely on the visual or auditory cues. What about trying to define quotations semantically? The source material mentions the idea that an expression is quoted if it's being mentioned.
Ah, yes, the use-mention distinction. That's a classic philosophical tool, but it brings its own set of challenges. For starters, some theorists want to keep mention and quotation separate. For them, defining one in terms of the other is circular reasoning.
So we're already in philosophical hot water if we try to define one using the other.
Right, and think about that example again. Bachelor has 8 letters. Is bachelor being used there in any way? It seems like it's referring to itself, to its form, rather than to its usual meaning. So if we say it's being used, but not in the normal way, then what does that mean? What's the difference between a normal and an abnormal semantic value? It's a whole other philosophical can of worms.
Okay, so it seems that whether we try to define quotation based on how it looks or what it means, we run into philosophical roadblocks.
That's why the source material takes a step back and suggests we start by simply identifying quotation through examples. We acknowledge that the exact boundaries of this linguistic phenomenon are still up for debate.
All right, so we have a general sense of what we're dealing with, but we need more than just examples. What are the key features of quotation, the things that any good theory needs to explain? The source material lists 6 of these.
These are like the data points, the essential behaviors of quotation that any aspiring theory needs to account for. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely, let's hear them.
Okay, first up is BQ1, opacity. We touched on this earlier with the bachelor example. Remember how substituting unmarried man changed the truth value?
Right, because within quotation marks, we're focused on the specific form, not just the meaning.
Precisely. Next is BQ2. No quantifying in. The fact that you can't infer from bachelor has 8 letters, that there exists some X such that X has 8 letters, you can't just stick a quantifier inside a quote.
Right, like you can't reach inside those quotation marks and mess with the structure of the quoted phrase. It's a self-contained unit.
Exactly. Now, BQ3 is all about the capacity for novelty. Quotation lets us introduce new words or symbols into our discourse. Think about a sentence like, "Ache not a part of any English expression." We can understand that even if we've never seen that symbol before.
Right, so quotation lets us talk about things that aren't even part of our language yet.
Exactly. BQ4 highlights the close relationship between a quotation and its semantic value, the thing it quotes. There's an obvious connection between, say, lobsters and the word lobsters that's just not there. Between the word and the actual crustaceans, it's like the quoted form is somehow contained in the quotation itself.
Right, the word is somehow present within its own quotation in a way that's just not true for other kinds of reference.
Absolutely. BQ5 is the idea of infinite capacity. Our understanding of quotation gives us the ability to grasp an endless number of new quotations. We don't need to memorize the meaning of every possible quotation individually.
Right, like we can understand a brand new sequence of characters within quotation marks without someone explaining it to us.
Exactly. And last but not least, BQ6, dual use and mention. This is a more subtle feature, particularly relevant to mixed quotation, like Quine said that quotation has a certain anomalous feature. Here, the quoted phrase is doing double duty. It's part of what Quine said, and it's being mentioned as the specific phrase he used.
So it's not a pure direct quote, nor is it completely indirect. It's a hybrid.
Precisely. And it's super common in everyday language, especially in philosophy and linguistics. So to recap, these 6 features, these BQs, they form a set of criteria that any good theory of quotation needs to meet.
Okay, they're like the benchmarks.
Exactly. And they lead naturally to a few fundamental questions that any theory of quotation must address. The source material highlights 3 of these.
All right, let's hear those guiding questions. What's the first one? Q1.
Q1 is all about what's doing the referring in a quotation. Is it the quotation marks themselves? Is it the expression inside the marks? Is it some combination of the two? Or could it be, as some have suggested, the speaker's intention that ultimately determines the referent?
So, right away, we're getting into deep philosophical territory about the nature of reference.
Yep. Now, Q2 asks about the how of reference. What's the mechanism? Are quotations like proper names just labels for expressions? Or are they descriptions, picking out expressions based on their properties? Or maybe they're like demonstratives, pointing to an instance of the expression. Or perhaps there's something else entirely, a sui generis form of reference.
Okay, so we need to figure out what kind of semantic machinery is running under the hood of quotation. And Q3.
Q3 is about the target of reference. What exactly do quotations refer to? Is it always the same kind of entity, like the type of the expression? Or could it be flexible, maybe sometimes referring to a token, sometimes a type, sometimes the meaning, and so on? That's a really big question.
So we have to figure out not just how, but what quotations pick out. Okay, before we get to the specific theories, the source material spends some time discussing a classic philosophical distinction: use and mention.
Right, the use-mention distinction. This comes up all the time in discussions of language, and it's particularly relevant to quotation. The standard way to explain it is this. When we use a word, we're talking about its usual referent in the world. Like in the sentence, Jim went to Paris, we're talking about the person Jim and his trip. But when we mention a word, we're talking about the word itself. Like in the sentence, Jim has 3 letters, we're not talking about the person anymore, but about the linguistic form Jim.
Okay, seems straightforward enough. Use refers to the world. Mention refers to the words.
That's the basic idea. But as with so many things in philosophy, the devil is in the details. Trying to give a precise, theory-neutral definition of this distinction turns out to be surprisingly hard.
Really? Why is that?
Well, consider trying to define mention in terms of quotation, like an expression E is mentioned if and only if it is quoted. The problem is, as we discussed earlier, you can mention expressions without using formal quotation marks. Italics, for example, can indicate mention, and in spoken language, there's no equivalent to quotation marks.
So that definition is too narrow. It misses a lot of potential cases of mention.
Exactly. What about trying to define mention as an expression is mentioned if and only if it's used to refer to itself? This also runs into issues. It implies that we have to use an expression to mention it, which is kind of paradoxical.
Yeah, that's weird.
And more importantly, it assumes that quotations are referring expressions, a point that some theories of quotation would actually deny. Some see quotations as more like descriptions, which don't directly refer to anything. Plus, think about sentences like, the first 7 words in the sentence contain 32 letters. That sentence is clearly referring to itself, but there are no quotation marks involved.
Okay, self-reference is a whole other rabbit hole we could go down. But the point here is that even the seemingly simple distinction between use and mention is philosophically loaded.
Right. It's not a neutral starting point we can just take for granted. Understanding the use-mention distinction likely requires us to have a theory of quotation in place.
So we can't just assume we understand what use and mention mean before we even start talking about quotations. Okay, let's move on to those theories then. What are some of the main attempts to make philosophical sense of quotation?
The source material outlines 5 main types of theories. Ready for a whirlwind tour of the philosophical landscape?
Bring it on.
Okay, let's start with what's often called the proper name theory. This is usually the first one you encounter in discussions of quotation, although it's often presented just to be quickly refuted. It's been associated with certain things that Quine and Tarski wrote, although it's debatable whether they actually fully endorsed it.
The proper name theory. So the basic idea is that a quotation, say cat, functions semantically like a proper name, like fluffy, but it's a name for the word cat.
Exactly. Think of Cicero as just a label for the linguistic form Cicero, just like Bob is a label for a particular person. The individual letters inside the quotation marks don't have any independent meaning.
Okay, so we're just slapping a label on the word itself.
Right. And this approach has some initial appeal. It explains BQ1, opacity, pretty easily. Cicero and Tully are just different names, even though they happen to refer to the same person. It also explains BQ2, the inability to quantify in, because you typically can't quantify into the internal structure of a proper name. And it allows for the introduction of new quotations, BQ3, just like we introduce new names for people.
Okay, so it scores some early points. But I'm guessing there are some fatal flaws, right? Philosophers don't usually stick with a theory for long if it's too easy.
You know it. One major problem is BQ5, the idea of infinite capacity. If quotations are just arbitrary names that we have to learn individually, then how do we understand a quotation we've never encountered before? It should be like hearing a random new name meaningless. But that's not how quotation works.
Right, we can understand a novel quotation because we can see the expression inside the quotes. It's not just an arbitrary label.
Exactly. Now, the source material mentions Gomez Torrente, who tried to defend the proper name theory by comparing quotations to street names. Like, you can understand Third Left Fork Road, even if you've never heard it before, because it follows a compositional pattern. But even with that analogy, the basic problem remains. Quotation seems much less arbitrary than just assigning names.
What's another problem with this theory?
It struggles to explain BQ4, the close relationship between a quotation and its content. The proper name theory treats the link between lobsters and the word lobsters as no different than the link between the word lobsters and the crustaceans themselves. It's purely accidental. Davidson famously said it's like the category of names that begin and end with A.
So it's missing that intuitive connection, the way the quoted expression is somehow embedded in its quotation.
Exactly. And then there's the big one, BQ6, dual use and mention. If quotations are just names, how do we explain cases like, Quine said that quotation has a certain anomalous feature? According to the proper name theory, that should be like saying Quine said that quotation Ted.
Which doesn't make sense.
Right, it completely misses the fact that the quoted phrase itself is part of what Quine said. So the proper name theory, while simple, just doesn't cut it.
Okay, time to move on to the next contestant in our philosophical game show.
All right, up next is the description theory. This arose partly from the idea that quotations aren't necessarily these big, indivisible units. Think about a quoted sentence like, man is mortal.
Okay, yeah.
Geach argued that we should understand that as a sequence of quoted expressions. The word man followed by the word is, and so on.
So instead of one big name, we have a description of the individual words that make up the quoted expression.
Precisely. Geach took words as the basic unit, while Quine and Tarski, in their versions of the theory, went all the way down to individual letters. So bachelor has 8 letters, becomes the letter B, followed by A, followed by C, and so on, all the way to R. Each individual letter gets a quotation name, and we build up complex quotations from there.
Okay, I can see how that might be an improvement. Does it solve those pesky philosophical problems that tripped up the proper name theory?
Well, it might do better with BQ5, infinite capacity, because you only need a finite number of names for the basic unit's letters or words, and then you can generate endless combinations. But unfortunately, it still treats those basic units essentially as names, So it ends up inheriting a lot of the proper name theory's problems at that foundational level.
Ah, so back to square one in a way.
All right. There's still no explanation for how we grasp the meaning of new basic quotations, BQ3. It also doesn't really explain the close relationship, BQ4, at that level. And crucially, it still struggles with BQ6, dual use, and mention.
Meaning that the phrase example still sounds weird.
Exactly. Davidson pointed out that Geach's version would actually make a sentence like, Quine said that quotation, the phrase, grammatically wrong. And on top of all that, Davidson argued that the description theory can't handle BQ2, the inability to quantify in. If we're just describing a sequence of letters, it's not clear why we couldn't say something like there's a letter X such that the sequence BACX has 8 letters, which is clearly nonsense.
So we've added some internal structure but haven't really solved the fundamental philosophical issues. What's next on our list?
Next up, we have the demonstrative theory, which is arguably the most famous theory of quotation in 20th century philosophy. It's largely due to the work of Donald Davidson in his very influential essay, Quotation. It's sometimes also called the paratactic theory.
Demonstrative, so it's all about pointing, right?
Exactly. Davidson had this radical idea. He said that the quoted inscription itself doesn't actually refer to anything. It's not really a semantic constituent of the sentence in the usual way.
Wait, so the words in quotes are doing nothing semantically.
That was Davidson's claim. He said the quotation marks are actually a disguised, definite description containing a demonstrative, something like the expression of which this is a token. And the quoted material is just there to be pointed at by this demonstrative. That's like you're saying, look at this thing, the expression I just produced. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, there's definitely a different way to think about it. So bachelor has 8 letters. Becomes something like bachelor. The expression of which that is a token has 8 letters.
You got it. The quotation marks, along with the demonstration, are what do the work of referring to the type of expression we're interested in.
Okay, that's pretty wild. So what are the advantages of this approach? Why go through all this philosophical gymnastics?
Well, it does a pretty good job at handling those basic quotational features. It explains BQ5 infinite capacity because we can demonstrate any number of things. It handles BQ1 opacity because different demonstrations can have different truth values.
Right, because the demonstrative is picking out a specific token each time.
Exactly. It gives a nice account of BQ6, dual use, and mention because the token is both being used in the reported speech and demonstrated as an object of reference. It can also explain BQ3, the introduction of new terms, because we can demonstrate anything, even made-up symbols. And lastly, it explains BQ2, no quantifying in, because the quoted token is, in a sense, outside the scope of the main sentence with the demonstrative description.
Okay, so it's scoring high on the philosophical scoreboard, but I'm guessing it's not without its problems, right? What are some of the objections to the demonstrative theory?
Well, one big one is what's called the wrong demonstratum problem. If the theory is right, and the real work is being done by a demonstrative, then it seems like we should be able to demonstrate anything when we quote something. But that's obviously not how it works.
Right, it has to be something related to the quoted expression.
Exactly. If I say bachelor has 8 letters, I'm not talking about the coffee cup in front of me, even though I could easily point to it while I'm speaking. There's a tighter connection between the quotation and what it refers to than just a random act of demonstration.
Okay, so the demonstrative can't be completely unconstrained. It has to be relevant to the content of the quotation.
Right, which leads to the problem of relevant features. Any token of an expression has tons of features: its physical shape, the font it's written in, the way it sounds when uttered, and so on. But when we demonstrate a token, how do we know which features we're picking out as the type of expression? As Block and Harmon put it, there's too much indeterminacy. Plus, there's the question of how a spoken quotation, which demonstrates a sound pattern, can refer to the same thing as a written quotation, which demonstrates a visual pattern.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. The meaning of a quotation seems to go beyond its specific physical manifestation.
Another challenge is the problem of missing quotation marks. We've already talked about how we can quote or mention things without using standard quotation marks. But Davidson's theory gives a central role to those marks. They trigger the whole demonstrative description thing. So how do we explain cases where the marks are absent?
Right, like those examples with italics.
Exactly. Now, defenders of the demonstrative theory have tried various responses, like saying that the quotation marks might be there implicitly or that these are just different phenomena altogether, but none of these responses are universally accepted.
All right, so the missing quotation marks are a sticking point. What else is there?
There's the problem of iteration, which arises when we consider nested quotations. Like the difference between smooth is an English expression and smooth is an English expression. When you try to apply Davidson's analysis to these cases, it gets messy. You end up with ungrammatical or nonsensical results.
So the theory has trouble with quotation about quotation.
Right. And then there's the issue of open quotation, where quoted expressions don't seem to function as proper noun phrases. Rekanati gives examples like, "Stop that, John. Nobody likes me. I am miserable. Don't you think you exaggerate a bit?"
Okay, yeah, it's like those quotes are just floating there and not really attached to anything grammatically.
Right. And that's hard to explain if you think, like Davidson, that the quotation marks are always setting up a definite description that acts as a noun phrase. So even though Davidson's theory was a major breakthrough, it still faces a lot of philosophical challenges.
All right, time to move on to the next contender. Who's up?
Okay, let's talk about the disquotational theory. This one is often presented as a simpler, more intuitive approach, and it's gained a lot of traction among philosophers of language.
Disquotational. It sounds like it's getting rid of the quotation mark somehow.
Exactly. The central idea is that quotation marks function as a kind of operator that takes an expression and spits it back out as its semantic value. It's like a linguistic undo button. Richard's disquotational quotation mark schema, or DQR for short, states that for any expression E, the quotation formed by enclosing it in quotes denotes E itself.
Okay, so snow is white just refers to the expression snow is white. The quotation marks are doing the work of, well, disquoting.
Precisely. Ludwig and Ray proposed something similar called a reference clause. And this approach has some nice features. It explains BQ1, opacity, very directly. Different expressions in quotes have different reference. It explains BQ2, no quantifying in, because there's no internal structure to quantify into. The whole quoted thing is treated as a single unit. And it explains BQ4, the close relationship in terms of straight-up identity. The quotation is the expression it contains.
Okay, so it's simple, elegant, and seems to handle some key features. What's the catch?
Well, it has trouble with BQ3, handling new words. If we say, for any expression E, what counts as an expression? Does it include symbols we haven't even thought of yet? The theory needs a way to specify what can be quoted, otherwise it can't handle novel expressions.
Right, we run into that problem of how to explain our understanding of new or unfamiliar symbols within quotation marks.
Exactly. And it also struggles with BQ6, dual use, and mention. If the quotation just refers to the expression itself, how can we explain cases like Quinane said that quotation has a certain anomalous feature? The disquotational theory would turn that into something like Quine said that quotation the phrase, which misses the point entirely.
Right, it loses that subtle interplay between use and mention.
Exactly. And just like the demonstrative theory, it has a hard time with quotation without quotation marks because it relies on the marks to do the semantic work of disquoting.
Okay, so even though it's attractive for its simplicity, it can't handle all the data. Who's our final philosophical contender?
Last but not least, we have what's sometimes called the identity theory of quotation, although, as the source material points out, it's probably better to call it the use theory.
Use theory. That suggests a shift in focus from the quotation marks to how we actually use language to quote things.
You got it. While the identity theory label comes from the idea that a quoted expression, in a sense, refers to itself, a relation of identity, folks like Washington, Sacca, Reimer, and Recanati emphasize that the real action is in a special use of language. Washington calls it quotational use, and Sacca calls it mentioning. They argue that quotation marks are actually a secondary phenomenon, a way to signal this special kind of use.
So if I say, my name is Donald, out loud, without any air quotes or anything, the word Donald is still being used in a quotational way to refer to itself.
That's the idea. Quotation marks in writing are just a convention to let the reader know that what's inside is being used in this quotational way, rather than with its normal meaning. So Donald refers to the word Donald because Donald is being used quotationally.
Okay, so we've moved from the semantics of quotation marks to the pragmatics of how we use language to quote things. It's about speakers' intentions.
Exactly. And proponents of this theory argue that it has several advantages. It can unify the way we think about formal quotation and our more general ability to mention things. It explains how we mention things in spoken language without any quote-unquote markers. And it offers a way to deal with BQ3, new terms, because anything we can mention we can quote. It also handles BQ4, the close relationship, through the idea of identity, the expression referring to itself, or instantiation. a token referring to its type. And BQ5 is covered by our boundless ability to mention things.
Okay, so it seems to address some of the persistent